And joining us now, Hershell Ezrin, former Principal Secretary to Premier David Peterson. Well, we wanted to get you in here today because you've been one of those guys behind the scenes who actually sits down with first ministers and senior advisors and figures out, why these shuffles happen. So let's start with that. Philosophically speaking, big shuffle yesterday, big shuffle today. Why do these kinds of things happen?
Well, they happen for different reasons. In some cases, like Mr. McGuinty's, he's getting ready for the next election. He's got to put the team in place that he thinks is going to be the best face for his government going into a fixed-year, kind of election. On the federal scene, I think they had a theme message that they wanted to portray. And that theme message was all about deficit reduction and control of government spending. And so they've cleverly tried to package the cabinet shuffle around that.
So when first ministers come out and say, we needed to put a new face on our government, or we wanted to give a fresh face, that's true?
Sometimes. Sometimes they have people who are in trouble. Remember, we had a cabinet minister a few years ago who kept leaving secret documents in his girlfriend's house and things like that. So there are other reasons why you have cabinet shuffles too. And opposition parties love cabinet changes because they can pin the responsibility on only one person. That's the premier or the prime minister of the day. It's really valuable because nobody else is responsible for choosing them.
Right. How do you know whether you need just a little bit of tinkering or something larger like we've seen over the last couple of days?
One of the problems that you have in all of this is that you're never quite sure, and sometimes because the pieces are all moving parts, you start to make just one or two changes and then you realize you have to make 3 or 4 more to make the first 2 actually work. And there is a human dimension in cabinet changes that's really important. If you've been a loyal supporter of the Premier or Prime Minister for a long period of time, you have a certain degree of ask that you can make back saying, I really don't want to move, I really don't want to be changed. And sometimes they even listen to you.
Can you give me a for instance where that was the case?
I prefer not to.
Come on, come on.
No. It's, but I've been in cases where we had a situation where we had a list. It was all prepared and we had the right balance, the right number of women, of ethnics, of the different regions of a province. It was in the province. And all of a sudden somebody walked in and pleaded their special case with the Premier and we went back to the drawing board with 12 hours left.
Because the guy didn't want to move.
That's right.
Huh. How much of a factor in a shuffle is the Premier wanting to reward those who have been loyal to him and punish those who have not been?
That happens sometimes, often at the beginning of a term. And so you saw Mr. Harper, for example, who rewarded certain of his loyalists at the beginning, and then the numbers always started, but why didn't you take so-and-so who was so competent? Ms. Oblonsky is the perfect example of that a number of years ago. And finally, the pressure builds and builds and builds, and you have to bring some of these people in.
These moves, I don't have to tell you, are followed very carefully by insiders at Queen's Park, insiders on Parliament Hill. When you were one of those insiders, did you have any sense about how carefully the general public followed all of this?
Oh, very much so, because it's a horse, there's always betting on both sides, and you don't want to risk seats. If someone looks like they've been demoted, you could potentially risk that seat in the next election. So you want to be really careful about that. And the other side of it is if they're sitting in the back benches and there's no control over them anymore, they can make a lot of trouble for you.
So you think the public really does pay attention to some of the, does it matter who the new citizenship minister is versus who the new consumer minister is, that kind of stuff?
Sometimes it matters, especially in more rural or suburban ridings where there's a closer relationship between the individual candidates. In urban ridings, it's sometimes only the profile of the person that will make a difference.
Has your view on this changed at all now that you've been out of government for a while?
No, I just think it's a really hard thing because you've got to match competence on the one side with the ability to actually prove to people that you're putting a fresh face on things, and then that you've also taken into account all of these nefarious differences, geography and gender and all the rest. It's a really tough business.
Talk to us for a bit about jealousy here, and I'll give you the example that I'm thinking of. In the riding we're sitting in right now, St. Paul's riding, we have a very new MPP, Eric Hoskins, who just got elected in a by-election.
And he got in to cabinet, and all of a sudden, all these people who've been sitting in the back row for 8 years are saying, but I've gone to all the party fundraisers. I've eaten more rubber chicken than you could ever imagine. I've cared about the party and done all of these things, and I'm being forgotten. And so what does that mean for my own political career? How do I explain this to my family? How do I explain this to my friends? This is the stuff, the real drama that happens in a cabinet shuffle.
And this is happening. Clearly
Absolutely.
we've got a guy now who's in cabinet who's only been an MPP for a few months. And there are others who've been back there for a long time and who can't get a sniff of the thing.
So what do? Do you tell people that, well, he's better looking, smarter, and more electable than I am? I mean, it's a hard message for someone who's in politics to convey.
And Hoskin's got citizenship. He has no particular background in that. Does that matter at all when you're putting a cabinet together?
It may or may not. I mean, his background, as I understand it, is he has done work in the international development field, and so he has an interest in certain areas. In competence, you've always got to make sure that you've got the quality of judgment, because you're there to promote government policies, but also to defend against attacks. And remember, ministers are expendable if they don't make the cut and do the right things right.
Let me just show you a few of the headlines that were in some of the local newspapers across the province today. Here's from the Hamilton Spectator. Aggelonitis shuffled in, McMeekin out. How about the London Free Press? Mitchell, the London region's 4th cabinet minister. Kingston Whig Standard, Gerretsen retains environment portfolio. The fact that their local guy is still in was a headline story in the Kingston Whig Standard. The media, of course, very focused on who's up, who's down, who's in, who's out. How much do the ministers or the MPPs or the MPs themselves keep score?
They all keep score, but I'll tell you the people who keep score the most are the ones you haven't mentioned yet, the staff. The political staff are always trying to jockey to see who they can work with, that's who's on the uprise. And they also look at other people who may be on the way down and say, do I really want an assignment in that job, or is it going to be career limiting for me? So it's not just the cabinet ministers who have an interest in all of this. It's also all of the political staff, and the ability to influence party policy, the ability to influence the different things that are going on can be affected by whether you look like you're on the upswing or on the downs.
People probably forget that, right? When a minister gets dumped from cabinet, it's not just that person who has to deal with the shame and the, and all of that. All their staff gets fired too, or a lot of them get fired too, don't they?
Well, some of them get picked up, but a lot of them don't really get the next plum job, and that's a real problem for them.
Let me follow up on that, because I remember talking to former Premier William Davis about this, and he said the hardest, he's Premier 14 years, and you'd think he would have a lot of hard things to do in the course of that 14 years. And he said the hardest thing I ever had to do was fire a minister, was to go up to somebody who I'd worked with on a regular basis, who's a friend of mine, and say, for one reason or another, I'm ending your political career. How does that work?
It doesn't quite work as directly as that. There are people like me who have the first conversation and remind ministers about the reasons that they ran, encourage them to understand that the party has certain needs at a particular time, and ask them to carefully consider whether they might see it in the interests of the party and the Premier, whom they've given so much loyalty.
Who could possibly do that, really? Who could see that bigger picture when they've just been defrocked?
Well, you still ask them.
Now, you raised something interesting there, which is if there is a firing from cabinet that has to take place, and there were a number of ministers, federally and provincially, who lost their jobs as a result of all this, does the Premier himself or the Prime Minister himself do that?
They may well do, well, first of all, they have to make the decision. And so they're carefully implicated. The fingerprints are there regardless.
No, but I mean, do they make the call, or do they call them in?
But the difference may be that there's an initial discussion with someone else. It could be the Deputy Prime Minister. I mean, Eric Nielsen tells some wonderful stories of the messages that he had to deliver on behalf of different Prime Ministers that he served. But you do have to have an intermediary to pave the way, because sometimes the shock of it is very great. The individual wants a little time to think about how he or she is going to react before they have that ultimate discussion with the boss.
Okay, let's get a little more in depth on this, because if memory serves here, when you were Chief of Staff to David Peterson, I think you lost 8 ministers or something in the first...
We lost several, and
I think it was 8. Now,
I had some of those discussions initially, and then of course they met with the Premier, and I think they did the honorable thing.
But when you say they do the honorable thing, is that really either you or him telling them you got to go?
Well, it's a complicated matter. Everyone serves at pleasure in this exercise. So the important thing about the messaging is that you want people to have a sense of dignity, and they have done good jobs. In some of the cases of those individuals, this wasn't a shift because you were deciding that you were moving them from one portfolio to another. It was because something had gone wrong in the ministry that they were working in, or in some personal aspect of their life, and as a result they were taking the full accountability and the full responsibility. For that I do admire and respect them. That's the nature of the game, but it's a heavy price that you pay.
Now, tell us again about how this kind of works in real life. When Dalton McGuinty came in the first time, now let me think here, this might have been 2007. David Ramsey was in cabinet, Monty Quinter was in cabinet. When he won re-election, they got dropped. People who've been around public life for decades. Right. And then a few more people got dropped in the shuffle that took place yesterday. Queen's Park, I don't have to tell you, is a place where people, a lot of their self-worth is determined by what title comes after their name. When you've been dumped from cabinet, you lose your title, you lose a lot of your self-worth. How do you keep these people motivated, happy, not kind of poisoning the rest of them because they're so upset at losing their job?
It depends both on the nature of the person and the reasons that they got into politics. In some cases, and both of the individuals you mentioned are very good examples, Quinter and Ramsey, they were involved in politics for a variety of reasons that dealt with their own constituencies and the rest, and they continued to build. Monty went on to do a lot of work on interparliamentary work, international work, Ramsey in the north. I mean, so as a result, you find interest for them, and then frankly, sometimes they have even more influence because it's harder for you to say no to them in those circumstances because they have paid a certain price, and if they're pushing for their ideas and for their goals, sometimes you really want to take them into account in government's policy making.
When the Premier does a shuffle, who's in the room?
Few people as possible.
What number?
Like one, the Premier. You're talking about the actual informing of individuals?
No, I mean when you're sitting down and you've got this person's name and this portfolio and you've got to do your mixing and matching. How many people are a part of that exercise?
Generally speaking, there are 3 or 4. You would see a senior political advisor to the Premier. You might see the head of the cabinet office, for example, because there are many issues that deal with policy matters and mandates. Remember, each minister who's being moved is being given a mandate letter or a form of documentation saying, this is what we expect of you in your new responsibility. So this has to be nailed down as well in policy terms. And you might have, at some point, the communications people who are being kept advised. They won't for sure not be involved in some of the first discussions because journalists like yourself are constantly going to be asking them what they know, and they can honestly say they don't know the details of, that are going on.
So how is it then, if it's such a tight circle of people who know that when we pick up the newspaper the day of the shuffle, most of it's in the paper already?
Well, sometimes we tell you in advance, and that's because we're trying to shape the story for the way that we want to do it. And so there are judicious leaks that are made. Of course, journalists earn all of these leaks, but they're judicious nonetheless. But on the other hand, sometimes there are mistakes made. An individual is phoned, asked to think about it overnight, and the news gets out. Staff is told, a staff member of that minister who might be changed says something to someone else, and if you have a secret, don't tell it to anybody because it's not a secret anymore.
So there's a lot of, I mean, obviously knowledge is power in these circumstances. So if you know something, you can't prove to anybody that you're in the loop unless you spill the beans, right? Is that why a lot of the beans get spilled?
Absolutely.
Is this a crazy way to run a railroad?
It happens in business just the same way. Boards meet, they decide that they're going to change the CEO, they decide they're going to change the direction of the company or they're going to sell it, and often you don't know about it for weeks, and then all of a sudden you hear this judicious set of leaks and it happens. So it's life.
Okay, in our last minute and change here, tell me this then. Let's go for Ontario. The Premier has said, with less than 2 years to go before an election campaign, this is, we're putting our game face on, this is our team. Does that mean that short of a big scandal or something like that, this is the group that he's going to be with for the next year and a half?
It may be that, yes, in short terms, but he may also have a couple more people that he wants to bring in at a particular time or create a vacancy or 2 more. But I think he's really building up the capacity to run the next election.
Now, the Prime Minister, of course, if he wants to create a vacancy so he can move somebody in, has, the best power of appointment,
Senate.
which is the Senate, exactly.
Yeah.
Now, the Premier of Ontario doesn't have that. So if he wants to kind of move the deck chairs in that way, how does he do it?
Well, he can sometimes, if he get his friends in Ottawa to appoint someone to the Senate, that's happened before. But you also have the opportunity of appointing people to unique boards, agencies, and commissions. You have the opportunity of giving them responsibilities on special inquiries that you want done, or a blue ribbon panel that's to be led. And some people, remember, are just tired and have decided that they want to withdraw from this kind of life. And some of the individuals who changed in the Ontario government, I believe, were in a situation where they were already indicating they didn't want to run in in the next election.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, they had a ministers only, no staff cabinet meeting at the end of December in Ontario, where they said, whoever's not running again, you tell us now because we want to make some changes. And I gather people were honest in that meeting and were saying, yeah, we're not going to run again, so you can turf us now. That's unusual, isn't it?
No, I think there are a lot of very, and I use the word noble in the best sense of the word. There are noble people. These people on all political parties got in because they wanted to do something, and they understand. There is a sense of loyalty to the person who helped you get elected, the person who put you in cabinet, and you have a sense of loyalty back about giving them some heads up when you know you're not going to run again.
In our last 10 seconds here, on balance, is a cabinet shuffle day a happy day for those who win, or is it a miserable day if you didn't get in?
It's a really miserable day if you didn't get in because you have to spend the next 2 weeks explaining to all your friends why.
Okay, Hershell, thanks so much for coming in and helping us understand this tonight.